Good morning. Welcome to another workshop in the middle of June as we begin to exit completely out of the lockdown of COVID-19. My name is Charles Sine. Thank you for joining us today as we continue our workshop series on longevity workshop series. So this workshop is sponsored by Anti-Fragility Health, and we do have a clinic here in Anaheim and a clinic in the Palm Desert. Also, we have a clinic in Vietnam in Ho Chi Minh City. So join us on Facebook, where we do a lot of updates. We have different branding representations there. One of the latest ones is our Ivy Lounge. You can also join us on Instagram, and you can join us on LinkedIn and other places. Please do share, love, like us, and send your comments as you enjoy this series, which is primarily shot on YouTube and then shared across the other platforms. So let's get into it. Typically, I run this workshop for 30 minutes. They are all in our playlists on YouTube, where you can find it completely. And we appreciate the fact that you join us, and we thank you for doing that. So let's start our workshop today. The focus today is going to be on clinical imbalances. I have been running this big workshop on longevity, but in the context of longevity, which is health span and lifespan, I also want to talk about the next series of workshops we'll begin running, which are about 10 of them, which are the 10 clinical imbalances. But let me just remind you what the 9 levers of control, which are the things that you have in your possession to control your lifespan and your health span. We spoke about mindset. There are 2 kinds of mindset, negative and positive, or what we call growth mindsets. People who are always looking at possibility, people who are always imagining, who are taking action, who are changing, and ensuring that they achieve the outcomes they're looking for. That positive mindset, as we know, is a very powerful force in nature in terms of creating the outcomes that we want. Sleep. 1/3 of our lives is spent sleeping. We spoke a lot about sleep physiology and some of the dysfunctional issues in sleep, like sleep apnea, insomnia, which are the challenges that really cause a lot of clinical imbalances. If we're not sleeping well, and not going through the 4 stages of sleep over an 8-hour period properly, then there are deep consequences for not achieving that. And we spoke about that, and we have lots of solutions to address the sleep issue. The mindset one, hey, you have to talk to me privately to get that. Exercise. Everybody knows that. There's no excuse. Watching TV or watching people play tennis is not exercise. You have to get your butt off the chair and actually go do it. Toxicity, big one. We all live in a very toxic environment, and it's getting more and more so as we create a lot of what we call chemicals that do not exist in nature. We've created a lot of new chemicals, plastics, lots of pollution elements, and we've also released heavy metals that were locked up in the soil in the earth. We've released them into the atmosphere, and we are breathing all of that in very high levels. And so toxicity is the reason, one of the big reasons why cancer and other chronic illnesses are on the increase. And we're going to talk about that in terms of the imbalances. Genetics, right? There is genetics and there's epigenetics. We run a whole workshop on that, what you inherited, and how your lifestyle then complicates that inheritance in terms of what we call protein expression, right? From DNA to RNA to proteins. That's the architecture of life. And the RNA can be interrupted by lifestyle changing the gene expression. It's a very important issue. That's why you might not have inherited heart disease, but based on your lifestyle, your genes are now expressing that, right? They're expressing real issues with the heart architecture and circulation and heart performance. And that becomes what your children will then inherit over time. And that's really the challenges with DNA dysfunction and things like that. We spoke about exogenous compounds, lots of exogenous compounds, nutrients, stem cells, exosomes, NAD, peptides, lots of new technologies and compounds emerging that can help with regard to health span and lifespan. Exogenous because they're from outside, they are not made inside the body. Infections and allergens, we spoke a lot about that in the last couple of weeks, about how infections compromise our health. Persistent infections like UTI and other things. Therefore, prevention and ensuring that we don't suffer from persistent attacks on the immune system is really one of the key issues also around lifespan and health span. Therefore, prevention and keeping yourself healthy is really a very important issue. Stress, the big one, we looked at all the 4 areas of stress: sleep, inflammation, sugar metabolism, and perceived stress, all within our management and things that we can actually take control. Nutrition, the last big one. We all know about diet restriction, calorie restriction, and diet restrictions. We know about fasting. All those things to facilitate that we get, right? Intermittent fasting allows mitophagy and autophagy to proceed, which are cell clearing, the debris clearing in our cellular architecture, which is the cells eating up themselves. It's an amazing thing to see. And it's a good way of clearing debris. So they eat unstructured or misfolded proteins and convert them into new kinds of proteins. They use the leftover. It's a very good way of the body creating sustainability in itself. And so it's really important as we look at all these things that these are things within our control. But life is tough to stay on top of all these things. How do we know we're doing well? But before we look at that, how are we doing with regard to these levels? Let's go to the theory. And 2 big emerging areas of research are pointing to us what are some of the long-term outcomes of life itself. And the 2 that I'm bringing to you today, the first one is the Hallmarks of Aging. Everybody can read that. Go do the research around that. There are some 9 critical things that drive aging, right? We are trying to look at lifespan. Aging is a challenge to lifespan. So the challenge is, how do we slow down the aging process so we can increase lifespan? That's really at the core of it, because if all those 9 areas, I spoke about some of them I think last week, if we can slow them down, then we can live longer. That's at the critical core. We are not saying we are extending life. We're slowing down the aging process, therefore extending life. That is really the key issue. When you accelerate the aging process, you reduce lifespan. When you slow down the aging process, you increase lifespan. It's really critical. And I think I walked through some of those conversations last week when I spoke about the primary hallmarks, the causes of damage, genomic instability, telomere attrition, epigenetic alterations, and loss of proteostasis, which is the protein misfolding and architecture. The epigenetic stuff, I spoke about that. The telomere, which is the edges of the DNA, and then just the instability, genomic instability that comes with the life, just the copying architecture. Those are the primary hallmarks. Then we look at the responses to that damage. One of the big ones is mitochondrial dysfunction, cellular senescence, cells refuse to die properly, and deregulated nutrient sensing, right? Very, very big things there. But one of the big ones that we're going to we just want to explore today is the whole issue of mitochondrial dysfunction. And I've brought some products around this issue of mitochondrial dysfunction that are some very critical products, because one of the biggest things we're going to talk about, one of the early signs for disease and aging is fatigue, the loss of energy. And energy powers everything. And what is the energy power cell in our body, architecture in our body? It's the mitochondria. So mitochondrial dysfunction, we're being led from all the research, is at the source, one of the primary drivers of aging and chronic illness. It's really important we understand that. Say, for example, the immune system. If the immune cells do not have enough energy, they cannot fight the long fight against COVID or any infections. So energy is at the source of aging and chronic illness. It's really important we understand that. And what is at the source of mitochondrial dysfunction? Number one is the reactive oxygen species. What is the reactive oxygen species? It's the end products of the ATP, of energy production. It's the waste. We also have NAD deplenishing. NAD, the nicotinamide, it is the molecule that helps be in communication between the cell, the cytoplasm, and the mitochondria for the timing of energy production. As that depletes, it causes challenges. We also have mitochondrial proteins misshaping, right? The loss of proteases we spoke about. We also have mitochondrial DNA misfunctioning. We also have mitophagy, which is that the bad mitochondrial cells are not being destroyed as required. We remember I spoke about autophagy, which is the cellular eating of itself. Then we have mitophagy. The mitochondria and the cell are in a symbiotic relationship. The mitochondria was not always part of the cell. It is a parasitic invasion of the cell that has become the main power source of driving cellular performance. It's really important we understand. So when we talk about autophagy and mitophagy, mitophagy is the death cycle of the mitochondria, and autophagy is the death cycle for the cells, eating themselves up so that they don't clog performance, they don't disturb, so that it's like walking into the bathroom and all the tissue is on the floor, right? You want to clean it, that allows easy passage. What else? We just have nitrogen species and oxygen species. So mitochondrial dysfunction is really at the heart, as I'm repeating myself, at the heart of chronic illness and aging. Therefore, what are the things that we do, right? So we have products like this, right, that are providing things that are going to optimize and ensure, reverse, and prevent mitochondrial damage. Really critical. So we have quite a few products here. We have Mito PQQ. We have MitoQ, very great Australian product. As we know, the heart, the brain, the lungs, and a lot of these critical organs are densely packed with mitochondria. Imagine the heart that is pumping for 100 years, densely packed with mitochondria. So when we have cardiometabolic dysfunction, at the heart of that dysfunction is the mitochondrial dysfunction in the heart architecture. It's really important that we get that, okay? And that comes from a lot of things, from exhaustion, and we can talk about different things around that. That's one critical area. Hallmarks of aging at the core, mitochondrial dysfunction. But we've looked at another research area, one of the critical chronic illnesses, cancer, and we've looked at the critical issues around the hallmarks of cancer. And there are quite a few of them. I'm not going to go through all of that today. But let's explore that. Inflammation. one of the big hallmarks, lipid metabolism and sugar metabolism. So let's start with inflammation. At the core of inflammation, inflammation is a good thing. When the body is attacked, inflammation is a signal for the body to respond. It is our responding mechanism to attack. And so we can have acute inflammation, which is there's impact, inflammatory signals are sent, there's swelling because of the accumulation of the macrophages, the things that are coming to fight, and the signals are then sent because we now identify what the foreign agent is, so we now resource the right things for the attack. That in itself downregulates other things in the body. That's a critical issue. Inflammation is a good thing, but when inflammation becomes chronic, that downregulation of other metabolic functions is what causes inflammation to become a critical challenge for aging and health. So we really need to understand the difference between acute and chronic inflammation. So what causes chronic inflammation? I said that earlier. If you persistently have UTI infections, that leads to chronic inflammation, because every time that attack persists and you have swelling and pain, the body has to downregulate other metabolic functions to send resources to that site for the response. That's a distraction from other critical things like another attack by another infection like COVID, another attack on things like cells that are going crazy because they don't want to die, therefore become cancerous. So there are other responses that the body is deviated from when it is disturbed by persistent chronic inflammation, like stomach infections, UTIs, mouth infections. That's why we all know that the mouth, the stomach, this area, the infections in those areas are really, really critical, because they become chronic or lung infections, and then or liver or kidney infections, and they become a critical issue in our life because they lead to chronic inflammation. Therefore, doing these healthy things would reduce that inflammation. A lot of sugar in the blood causes inflammation. Infections causing lack of sleep causes inflammation because the body didn't have enough time. So inflammatory signals come from all these things. We know when we exercise, we reduce inflammation. When we sleep well, we are strengthened. We have more energy. When you don't sleep well, we don't, because the body is not fully repaired, right? If you don't have the right mindset, so all of these things would in fact impact inflammation. Let's look at lipid metabolism, very critical early signal to chronic health. To chronic disease. Triglycerides and the whole issue of cholesterol and the liver managing the lipid affluent architectures of LDL and HDL, a very complex mechanism that the liver does of getting fat cholesterol into the bloodstream carried by HDL, the big boys, and then when it gets into the bloodstream, the LDL carries it into the muscular tissue. When there is too much fat in the bloodstream, or if inflammatory signals are calling, we would go deposit cholesterol to calm down the inflammation. That's what causes blockages in the bloodstream with cholesterol. Cholesterol is not a bad thing. Cholesterol is a good thing. The body needs it. But when there's too much of it, it is a problem. And then when there's too little of it, it's a problem. God and his issue of balance an equilibrium. And that's the issue with LDL and HDL. I'm not going to go, that's a big topic we're going to talk about when we look at the signals of cardiometabolic. Sugar metabolism, big challenge. We have lots of products here for sugar metabolism. Berberine, Diaxonal, AMPK, these products help reduce the amount of sugar in the blood, because sugar in the blood causes inflammatory signals and causes significant deregulations. And that is what the body then converts into fat and says, hey, liver, deal with this. And then the liver is overwhelmed. What do I do with it? So it stores it as fat. Also, we have the pancreatic cells, right? The beta cells that produce insulin that are overwhelmed and then become insulin resistant. And that's the sources of obesity and diabetes and all the complications, the vascularization issues around diabetic issues. So really, when we look at these three big things, inflammation, lipid metabolism, and sugar metabolism, we begin to look at really at the core hallmarks of cancer. So we've looked at chronic illness and we've looked at aging. Now, how are we gonna, what are the indicators? What are the signals? That's why we do diagnostics. That's why diagnostics are critical, because homeostasis, which is the equilibrium of the body, we don't know. So signals, diagnostic signals, are indicators to us of what's going on, and when we do interventions, whether those interventions are working or not. Because they all have to be personalized, because we all have different health architectures as individuals. So let's look at the 10 signals that we'll be talking about over the next 6 weeks. And these are the 10 signals or areas of diagnostics where we look at measurements that begin to allow us to intervene appropriately. Cardiometabolic signals. These are signals of lipid, sugar, all the other things, right? Of the liver's performance, the kidney performance, inflammatory signals, heart performance, blood pressure, all those things, heart rate, that are critical signals that this machine is not running well. Number one, very, very important that we get those measurements. And those signals can either come from blood or from imaging or from different ways in which we look at those signals. But the body is giving signals that I'm not fine. And we use those signals as drivers for intervention. Stress signals, right? We look at your sympathetic and your parasympathetic response, and it begins to tell us to how you manage your stress responses. And those are the signals that you're overstressed. This sympathetic nervous system does not hand over properly to the parasympathetic nervous system at night, and the parasympathetic system hands over to the sympathetic system during the day. The sympathetic nervous system is our fight and flight response architecture, driven by a cortical architecture, and the parasympathetic nervous system that provides rest and restoration, driven by melatonin, DHEA, and all the other hormone systems. So really critical signals. Immune, right? We spoke about our adaptive and innate immune architecture. So the signals around that, when our immune system suffers from immunosuppressed because of persistent inflammation or other things that are attacking the body, or immunosenescence, or the mitochondrial dysfunction in our immune system, then we have a compromised immune architecture. And we can see that in terms of how the immune system is responding. Those are key signals. GI, big signals from the GI, one of the key conductors of the immune system. That's why we have very important probiotics, digestive agents to support and provide us with the greens and the fiber. All these things to support and provide a very, very the regulated GI architecture. Musculoskeletal, right? We're talking about muscle, bones, cartilage, and all the things that give this mechanical form, movement, stability, strength. And what is the big signal? Pain. It's a big signal. And pain is an inflammatory response. And so when we have arthritis and all of those issues, we know there is an underlying chronic inflammation driver that is sending those key signals. And so most of modern medicine uses medications to mask the signal, but not address the source of that signal. Energy, I spoke about fatigue. Circulation, right? We all know that if we don't have good macro and micro circulation, the vascular architecture, which is the arterial and the venous system of taking blood to all the areas and bringing blood back to the heart for oxygenation, if that process is compromised, the nutrients that are required don't get to where they need to go, and the used up, excreted material is not brought up and filtered out of the bloodstream in the kidney. Cognition signals. We start losing our memory and our recollection and our processing performance. Hormones, big challenge. We start having cycles, menstrual cycles that are out of whack. We start losing our periods, erectile dysfunction, libido, desire, all of those things that are really critical for us to enjoy and persist in life. And finally, toxicity, which I mentioned before, the poisons that we are introducing into our systems through water, air, food, and other means. So as I come to the end, over the next several weeks, 10 weeks or more, we'll be looking at each of these signals, or what I call clinical imbalances. They show up as diagnostic signals. And we'll look at the intervention strategies around them for prevention, reversal, and optimization. The critical issue here is that if we intervene and address the underlying signals that are showing up, we would then be taking actions around all these areas. That's the interesting thing. Most of our response here is going to come from all taking action in all of these things to ensure that we address these underlying drivers of aging and chronic illness. Thank you. Send your questions. Slightly over by 2 minutes. I started a bit late. I apologize. But thank you for watching, loving, liking us on YouTube, on Instagram, and on Facebook. Next week, we are going to begin this big journey of walking through the signals. And we'll walk through them carefully and mindfully so that in the end, we have knowledge. Knowledge leads to action. And action is what gives us access to the things that we want. And I know we all want to live a long and healthy life. And when we persist in action, it becomes habit. And a good habit then leads to those outcomes we desire. Thank you for joining us today. Have a wonderful weekend. We love you.